Hey everybody, this is Chris with Overclockers Club. We are at the end of the line for the 40 series graphics cards from Nvidia, so we'll be taking a look at the 4060 today. And with this being the end of the line or the end of the series, we will not see, at least as far as I know, we will not see a 4050. 4060 is as low as we go. And you'll notice this is not a Founders Edition. This is an AIC or an AIB add-in card or add-in board. It's made by Asus. It's the dual. There will be different versions from MSI and Gigabyte and quite a few other players, but we will not see a Founders Edition. And also there will only be an 8 GB version of this. This is an overclocked version, and again the AIB or AIC manufacturers, they take the guts from Nvidia and they add their own flavoring, their own styling, and their own feature set to sort of build upon it and set themselves apart from the competition. They do that in a variety of ways. Looking at the back of the box in a little more detail, now it says here in very fine print, image for reference only, because a lot of times while the product is in development, they've got to get the box art ready ahead of time, and sometimes there are changes, so the pictures don't always match exactly what's in the box. So here it just talks about the features from the Nvidia side, which means it supports all of the latest technology. Let me look at the front here, which is really your DLSS3, your ray tracing, your reflex, and your studio. So this will support the same technology as the rest of the 40 series cards, all the way up to the 4090. And usually it says, since this is the overclock version, I don't see anywhere where it talks about how much of an overclock, so I'll have to look into that, unless I missed it here. No, I don't see it right here. Usually it's not a whole lot of impressive performance in the overclock, because it's usually just a little bit over what the factory clock is. Looks like we've got 3 display ports and 1 HDMI port. And the other interesting thing here, we've got our GPU Tweak 3, which is a software package that you can use to get in there and tweak the card, basically. And now we can get it out of the box. Nothing there. All right, here's the card. And sometimes there's some goodies stashed underneath. Okay, yep. Quick start guide. Probably some warranty information. Yeah, warranty card. I believe this has a 3-year warranty. And this is some sort of a collector card? Trading card, maybe? I'll have to scan a little code there and see what comes up. And then this, I believe, is like a cell phone holder. So you snap this together and it's something to set your cell phone on. Off to the side, if you are in need of a cell phone holder. Okay, so the card, it's fairly lightweight compared to some of the other 40 series cards. And there we go. It's got a lot of protective plastic here that I'll get peeled off a little later. Let's see. Here are the 3 display ports, and the bottom one here should be HDMI. Yep. And we've got 2 fans. It looks like they spin in the same direction. I'll just go ahead and get this plastic peeled off now. All right, let's bring a couple other cards into the picture here. Zoom out a little bit. And what we've got, this is the 4060 Ti. And it's 4060, 4060 Ti, and the 4070. So you can see that the 4070 and the 4060 Ti are the same form factor. In fact, if it wasn't for the little color differentiation, there would be a little hard to tell them apart. And you can see we use the same 12 volt HP connector over here for power between the 4060 Ti and the 4070. And these are actually pretty heavy cards compared to the 4060. It's noticeably lighter. But the first thing I noticed here is that we use a standard 8-pin power connector here. We don't use the fancy 12-pin HPV or high performance connector there. I call it 12 volt HP or whatever, high power. 12 volt high power is what you've got here. And it's different on the 4060. So you can notice the card it's a little taller than the 4070 and the 4060 in terms of height. Not a whole lot though. The nice thing about these compact cards is they'll fit in some smaller cases. So it's just a little bit, if I line them up, it's a little taller and it's a little shorter. And it's a 2-slot card, maybe just a hair over 2 slots with the plastic front cover protruding a little bit. I don't think this one has any LED or RGB graphics on there. We'll see if anything lights up when we power it on. I'm not sure if it has any or not. Sometimes you don't know until you power it on. All right, so I think we're ready to do just that. And actually, before I do that, I'll point out a couple things. The end here is 304 stainless steel. And there's a little switch right here. It's got a P and a Q. That's usually performance mode and quiet mode. And what that does is that alters your fan profile. So in performance mode, the fans will, the fan curve tends to run such that the fans are moving more air, so they'll be a little louder. And if you want it in quiet mode, you can switch this over to Q and your fan profile will be adjusted to keep the fans quieter and running a little slower. Another nice thing is the back plane here has some holes in it to vent, you can see all the way through the fan there, to vent the heat out the back of the card. Of course, the heat can come out the end, the top, and the bottom, as well as the front of the card. So you've got a lot of opportunities for heat to get away from the card. And the front cover here is all plastic. I've seen some of the other cards that had metal, an actual cast frame, which is pretty cool. It adds in weight and adds in some cost, but nothing wrong with the plastic. Okay, so now I'll get the card installed. So here's what it looks like next to a 4080, and a 4080 and 4090 are the same chassis, but you can see it's a little shorter, quite a bit shorter in the length department, and it's of course thinner, but it's a 4060. So you got to expect it to be a fair amount smaller. Now, one thing I noticed on the reviews for the 4060 Ti, I was really kind of surprised how much crap people gave the 4060 Ti when it came out not long ago. And I'm not saying they're wrong. I kind of came away with a different perspective, because I guess the way I see it, you know, the 4060, the 4060 Ti, this is an entry-level card. And you've got to set your expectations accordingly. Because if you don't, if you go into it trying to compare it to the higher end cards with the higher price points, is that really doing it justice for what it is? Again, an entry-level card is geared towards the person who doesn't have $1,000 or $1,200, $1,500, $2,000 to drop on the high-end cards. Maybe they're building their first-time system and they don't have a lot of money, but they want the latest and greatest, as much as they can get for the money. So, okay, I got my drivers already updated. You always want to have the latest drivers anytime you have a new graphics card. But, you know, when it comes to performance, you know, are you going to be able to run this thing with all of the settings maxed out in your games? No, of course not. You're going to have to dumb some stuff down. You're going to have to run at 1080p maybe. I mean, I know there are alternatives. You can get used cards that have maybe better performance or equal performance for less money if you want to do that. But not everybody wants to spend their money on a used card. They want that brand new card. Anyway, let's go on with the rest of the testing here. So what I'll do is I'll do some synthetic benchmarks and some gaming benchmarks, and I'll look into the overclocking here and see how much of an overclock it really has. Okay, so it is gaming benchmark time. I did the synthetic along with the actual games. I don't do nearly the number of games that some of the sites do, just due to the amount of resources and time it takes to really do that. And a lot of times when we get these cards to review, there is not a lot of time from when you receive them to when the video has to go live. Anyway, I do the standard. I try to keep everything apples to apples. So we've got the 3070 Ti, 4060, and the 4060 Ti. And I'm really looking at comparing these two right here because they're so close. So the question for me would be, okay, is the 4060 Ti worth the extra money, which is not really a whole lot. But when we look at the numbers here, and again, it's scaling like we would expect from the 4090 all the way down to the 4060. And of course you see degrading performance, but we also see a significantly lower price point. So the 4060 here, when we look at the Blender numbers, again, we're a fair tick below the 4060 Ti. We get into the 3D mark with DLSS on and off, and it's not surprising, again, we see a drop. With the DLSS on, of course, is better, but it's still 10 frames lower than the 4060 Ti. And then I did the Port Royal and the Time Spy Extreme and the DirectX ray tracing, and again, we've got some lower numbers here. And VR mark, I just do that again just as a frame of reference, and we see sort of the same type of scaling. This one here in the middle, the cyan room, looks like it's the same regardless of what card you're using. It doesn't really change much. VRAM GPU RTX, we look at that also. That is very similar. In fact, it's actually just a tick higher than the 4060. So that tells me that on any day you could probably compare these two and get numbers that are going to oscillate back and forth between one being slightly higher than the other. Octane Bench, same thing. We've got numbers that keep dropping as we get down to the 4060. Borderlands 3, now we're getting into actual games. And what I noticed here, when you've got 46 frames per second, this is the benchmark. That's not real playable. Anything above 60 is your target, and here we're getting below that significantly. And what I did notice, though, when I actually went in and played the game, I was getting around 80 frames per second, and I didn't even really have to change any of the video settings. So gameplay, I played it for a while. I didn't really see any degradation that would make me think that I had to play it, I had to force it into 1080p mode or knock the settings down. So it actually did better than I was expecting on Borderlands. F122, you can see again the benchmarking here, the frame rates are really, really low, almost, well, pretty terrible. But when I go into 1080p mode, and I'll show you here the frame I pulled from that. And again, this is a 3440 by 1440p monitor. But when I go down into 1920 by 1080, and the 4060 really is focused on 1080p gaming. When I go down into that mode, you can see my average frames per second get into the 93, low 90s. So it's very playable at that range when you're going into 1080p mode. And I noticed the same thing going on here with Cyberpunk 2077. The frame rates here are absolutely abysmal in the benchmarking, but this is with everything cranked up as high as it'll go, with a 3440 by 1440p resolution, which again is outside of the scope of the 4060. It's really targeted at 1080p gaming, so that's what you have to keep in mind. When I switched over to 1080p, the same effect I saw with the F122, I noticed it in Cyberpunk. We got our frame rates up into the 80s, and the other effect you can do with 1080p or with the 1440 is you can actually bring some of your graphical settings down a notch or two. Some of the ones you can experiment, and you'll find that your frame rates will start to creep up to where it's playable. So what you have to keep in mind is the 4060 as well as the 4060 Ti, they are both targeted towards 1080p gaming. And when you keep them in that range, you can keep your settings toward the higher end, and in some cases, depending on the game, you can max them out. And this is the recommended power supply from ASUS. I sort of grabbed this slide here from ASUS, and we'll talk about what is recommended and the actual power usage here. But this is what ASUS recommends based on which card you're using and which system you're using. So if we're looking at an i5 or an AMD Ryzen 5, we're looking at 550 watts here for the 4060. Same recommendation if you have an i7 or an AMD Ryzen 7, and the same for an i9 AMD Ryzen 9. We also have 550. It only pops up here to 650 when we get into the Threadripper and the Intel high-end desktop. And as far as the basic specifications go, I sort of cobbled this together from a couple different slides from Nvidia, but we're looking at the 4060 Ti and the 4060. Again, those are the ones I'm really wanting to compare. We've also got a 3060 Ti and a 2060 Super. You can see the progression when we get into the 40 series here, how much more power we've got and how much less power we're using ultimately. But you can see the difference here between the 4060 and the 4060 Ti. You can see, I guess the big difference here, our memory subsystem. We've got 24 megabytes of L2 versus 32 megabytes of L2 on the subsystem. Frame buffers, we've got 8 and 8. Actually, I just received word today that the 16 gigabyte version of the 4060 Ti, that is not going to be released. That's what I was told. So we're only going to have an 8 gigabyte version of the 4060 and the 4060 Ti. So we got the latest 8th gen with AVI-1 for the NV encoder, DLSS 3. Here you can see a considerable difference on the tensor cores. You can see a considerable difference also on the RT cores and the shaders. So when you're looking at who's got more horsepower, the 4060 Ti clearly has an advantage. And now we'll look at the actual power used. There are a couple ways you can do that. You can use software to monitor that, but Nvidia actually sent me this cool device here. This is called a PCAT, and I'll go ahead and get it installed and show you how it actually works. And now we're on to checking out the power. There's the Nvidia PCAT right there. There's the riser. You can see it pushes the graphics card a fair distance off of the motherboard, but it comes down here to this circuit board, and basically you have power coming in from the power supply and power going out to the graphics card up here at the top. And we can measure in real time what kind of power is being used. You can look at the voltage also. And it's running a little high at idle. I'm not sure what's causing the load. Usually this thing should idle around, I don't know, 10, 15 watts. And it's a little higher than what I was expecting, but anyway, here is the software package that goes along with the little board there, so we can monitor, again in real time, the power that's being used. You can see the minimum there was 12, and that's usually what you see around idle. So like I said, something is drawing on it a little bit. So if we go ahead and use, for example, this MSI combustor, and we can go ahead and look at the, let's go ahead and run 1440. So this will put a load on the system, and we can look at what kind of power it's pulling. I don't know, I'm having trouble with the focus tonight. There you can see it spikes here and there, it goes up and down, but we can look at the graph if we go back. So here's what you see. You can see here's when it was idle. We spike up while we're doing some of the testing. You can see it varies. And then the peak there that we saw was 153. Again, that's just a real quick peak power usage. Actually, now that I go back and reference here, it shows 115 is your design power, and it shows idle power 7 watts. So for whatever reason, I'm up around 30. I thought it would be around 15, but it looks like it's even lower than that, which is good. But like I said, I got something going on here. Anyway, Okay, so I've been running this a little while, and again, we should be around 115 watts for the maximum. I'm actually coming in around 125. So we're a little bit higher than the target. And we're holding it around 66 to 67 degrees Celsius using the standard fan curve. Now, talking about some of the specifications here, I was looking for base clock is 1830 megahertz, boost clock is up to 2460. And this is the Asus GPU Tweak 3. You can get in here and make all kinds of changes. You can see the fans are like in a 0 RPM mode, so as long as the temperature is cool, then the fans don't run. Or we can manually override the fans, so I can turn one on, leave the other one off, turn the other one on. I can put them in auto mode, which again is like a 0 RPM, so when the temperature is low, the fans will produce no noise and stop. And we've got default mode up here. You've got overclock mode. You can see how your boost clock jumps up between default and overclock. There's a silent mode, which definitely pulls things down a little so we don't go into a mode where the fans are always running. There's a user mode where you can get in and make some customizations to your fan profile. Let's see, we've got different things over here you can monitor for your voltage, fan speed, boost clock. So that's a fun little software package to play around with. Okay, so I can pick on the 4060 because it doesn't do this and it doesn't do that. But the way I look at it is, if I'm building a system and I'm on a budget and I really don't have the money for a 4070, then my options are the 4060 Ti and the 4060. And the 4060 Ti right now is coming in at $399, and the 4060 is $299. So you're talking $100 difference between the 4060 and the 4060 Ti. The performance difference between the two, I think, is enough that it justifies the extra $100 to get the 4060 Ti. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the 4060, but it's close enough to the Ti. I would save the extra money if I had to, save up the extra 100 and get the Ti and get the additional performance that you get with this card for just the $100. The 4070, you know, you're going to have to shell out a fair amount of money more to get to that level. And a 4070 is going to cost you $599. So there's a, you know, not a huge jump, but enough of a jump between the 4060 Ti and the 4070. Maybe you want to save your money and go to the 4070 if you really can't live without that performance. But again, the 4060 Ti and the 4060, these are really targeted again towards your 1080p gaming. They'll run at higher resolutions, but the compromise is you're going to have to pull your graphics down, reduce some of the settings until you can get a playable frame rate. If you can live with that, then the 60 or the 60 Ti are going to be fine for you. If you can't live with that, then you're just going to have to save your money to get to the 4070, the 4070 Ti, or above. But of course, if you're considering those, then these really won't be on your radar. So with all that in consideration, I would give the RTX 4060 the Overclockers Club Silver Award. This is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.